I want to start off, I have a general question about the present. I love the way you talk about the post office and democracy as being in a kind of symbiotic relationship and a dynamic relationship that has changed over time. And there's so many ways to think about the Postal Service as a democratic institution. You mentioned the founding documents really positioned the Postal Service as the lifeblood of democracy in being central to kind of information flows that were newspapers at the time, but information flows that are at the center of democratic practice. But then over the years, more and more layers accrue. So it becomes a really important labor institution, a really important center of union activity and of African-American employment. It becomes both a fact and a symbol of good governance. It becomes a kind of iconic institution of our public sphere. And it becomes a central institution to our voting process, as Judge Marrero said. Where should our attention be fixed right now when we think about the relationship between the Postal Service and democracy? I know everyone is, I mean, the voting is the thing that's bound to fix your attention in this month. But I think the issues are much broader, and I'd just love to hear you reflect a little bit on some of the broader relationships right now in 2020 between the Postal Service and democracy.
Steve Hutkins and Mark Jameson from SaveThePostOffice.com have this wonderful piece that they just posted last week towards a postal reform agenda, and it just lays out the kind of things that could that take us from a place where we are, or many of us feel like today, where we feel like we need to defend the post office, and we're horrified at what's happening to the post office, but it needs to go beyond that. There needs to be a fix to the problem that we're left by the Postal Reorganization Act that made it half government agency and half business. So even before the pandemic, postal voting, postal balloting was gaining in popularity. People wouldn't have to take off work. 5 states were using it full time. The pandemic, I think, has accelerated that. So, I mean, it's a crucial issue now, what happens when the pandemic passes. I think there will still be a role for that, but it also highlights the importance of the Postal Service as a civic institution, as a government institution, as a service. It's what unites us. It's like the thing that upset so many people when they found their mail going from, well, we've seen the figures now, from 93% on time to down to 85 to down, 70% first class mail. It's like, wait, that's my stuff. Wait, other people have stuff too. The Postal Service is something that connects us, and suddenly it's not accountable. How did that happen? The Postmaster General can be called because there is congressional oversight, but he doesn't have to tell the truth. He doesn't have to, congressional oversight didn't impose anything on him. There had to be injunctions, and but what recourse is there? So, this brings up the other issue. Is I was just glancing at the Q&A. Somebody was talking about postal banking. The other functions that could be revived or invented as functions for the Postal Service, which we typically think of just being letter carriers, but of course there's over-the-road drivers, there are clerks, there are mail handlers, people who work in post offices and in mail sorting facilities that could be updated since the amount of mail and the types of mail are changing, okay? There's the post office, you notice I use those terms interchangeably. The post office, the Postal Service, it can continue to be a post office. It can grow into the 21st century. So it does not just have to be, in terms of once a year or twice a year delivering ballots. Essential connection for democracy is hubs for Wi-Fi, for instance.
Right. Here's a question. Can you say more about African Americans finding employment in the post office in the 19th century? In what ways was it different to be employed as a mailman, or let's just say in the mail service in general, compared to other working class jobs?
It's a great question. So a lot of jobs were not available in the private sector to African Americans because of outright prejudice from white employers, white employees, or both. And it was not that the Postal Service or the post office was standing there with open arms. I think it was, in my research for my book, There's Always Work at the Post Office, they found an entry into it. They, in many ways, forced their way in as soon as that legislation was passed that enabled them to work at the post office. they took advantage of patronage jobs, ironically through the Republican Party at the time. That was a party of equality. And in the South, it was more likely that they would be letter carriers. Over time, I did a lot of oral histories. African-American postal workers would talk about how there was like a gentleman's agreement. They would let them be letter carriers, whites, that is, white postal workers let them be letter carriers, but not clerks. But that might also vary town to town or state to state. But they made it a niche job, okay, through patronage, through the craft positions, through the postmasters, and they could be some of the first Black postal workers were abolitionists, were Union Army veterans, and they were also union members. They also helped found some of the unions. Yeah, this became the niche for them, to be employed at increasingly higher rates than their percentage of the population.
I want to come back to the banking question in just a second, but a little bit later, like in the early 20th century, I know that Pullman porters played a really important role in delivering newspapers. I mean, the famous one is the Chicago Defender, but the people working on the rails, and especially African-American men, played a really significant role in getting news out. After that kind of collapses as an alternative for Black employment, did some of those people end up in the postal service? Is there much traffic between the Brotherhood of Pullman car workers and postal workers?
Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
Yeah,
I never thought of that. I never thought of that connection because there was already a railway mail service. That started in 1864. The actual birth of the historically Black postal union, known as the National Alliance of Postal Employees, which is still extant as a federal workers union now, began in 1913 after Black railway mail clerks were excluded from the white railway clerks union. I'm not aware of any kind of connection, but that kind of mobility is similar for railway mail clerks to be able to sorting the mail as the trains go throughout the South, and distributing Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender. So not that different from Black mariners in the
right.
late 19th and late 18th and into the 19th century, smuggling abolitionist tracts in their clothing